19. Ringthane's Choice. Cord Rusta informed Prothal that according to the Raman custom, dead renders of the Ranahan were left for the vultures. The Raman had no desire to honor Kresh or to affront the earth by burying them, and pyres raised the danger of fire on the plains, so the riders could rest as soon as their horses were away from the smell of death. The cord led the company on southward for nearly a league, until he was satisfied that no night breeze would carry unrest to the animals. Then the quest camped. Covenant slept fitfully, as if he lay with the point of a spike against his stomach, and when the dawn came, he felt as ineffectual as if he had spent the night trying to counterpunch hunger. And when his nose tasted again the tangy smell of the poison amanibhavam, the sensation made his eyes water as if he had been struck. He did not believe that he could hold himself upright much longer, but he still did not have the answer he needed. He had found no new insight, and the green handiwork of Morin moss on his robe seemed illegible. A sure instinct told him that he could find what he lacked in the extremity of hunger. When his companions had eaten and were ready to travel again, he climbed dully onto Dura's back and rode with them. His eyes dripped senselessly from time to time, but he was not weeping. He felt charged with passion, but could not let it out. The grief of his leprosy did not permit any such release. In contrast to the cold ash of his mood, the day was cheery, full of bright, unclouded sun and a warm northward breeze, of deep sky and swift hills. Soon the rest of the company had surrendered to the spell of the plains, an incantation woven by the proud roaming of the Ranahan. Time and again mighty horses cantered or raced by, glancing aside at the riders with laughter in their eyes and keen shimmering calls in their throats. The sight of them added a spring to the strides of the cords, and as the morning passed, Grace and Thew sang together. Run, Ranahan, gallop, play, feed and drink, and coat gloss gleam. You are the marrow of the earth, no rein will curb, nor or bit control. No claw or fang unpunished rend, no horse blood drop without the healing grass. We are the Ramen, born to serve, main thrall curry, cord protect, win home hearth and bed anil. Our feet do not bear our hearts away. Grass-grown hooves and forehead stars, hawks and withers earthwood bloom. Regal Ranahan, gallop, run. We serve the tail of the sky, mane of the world. Hearing the song, Ranahan pranced around the company and away, running as smoothly as if the ground flowed in their strides. In Foamfollower's arms, Python stirred and shook off his day of sleep for a while to watch the Ranahan with something like longing in his blank eyes. Prothal and Moram sat relaxed in their saddles, as if for the first time since leaving Rebelstone they felt that the company was safe, and tears ran down Covenant's face as if it were a wall. In his emptiness, the heat of the sun confused him. His head seemed to be fulminating, and the sensation made him feel that he was perched on an unsteady height, where great gulfs of vertiginous grass snapped like wolves at his heels. But the clangor of his saddle held him on Dura's back. After a time he dozed into a dream where he danced and wept and made love at the commands of a satirical puppeteer. When he awoke, it was mid-afternoon, and there were mountains across most of the horizon ahead. The company was making good time, In fact, the horses were cantering now, as if the plains gave them more energy than they could contain. For a moment he looked ahead to Manholm, where he foresaw a misguided and valueless respect for his wedding ring would offer him to the Ranahin as a prospective rider. This was surely one of Prothal's reasons for choosing to visit the plains of Ra before approaching Mount Thunder. Honor the Urlord, the Ringthane. Ah, hell! He tried to envision himself riding a Ranahin, but his imagination could not make the leap. More than anything else, except Andalane, the great, dangerous, earth-powerful horses quintessenced the land, and Joan had been a breaker of horses. For some reason, the thought made his nose sting, and he tried to hold back his tears by gritting his teeth. The rest of the afternoon he passed by, watching the mountains. They grew ahead of the company as if the peaks were slowly clambering to their feet. Curving away southwest and northeast, the range was not as high as the mountains behind Mithel's Stone Down, but it was rugged and raw, as if high pinnacles had been shattered to make those forbidding impenetrable. Covenant did not know what lay behind the mountains, and did not want to know. Their impenetrability gave him an obscure comfort, as if they came between him and something he could not bear to see. They stood up more swiftly now, as the company rode at a slow run toward them. The sun was dipping into the western plains as the riders entered the foothills of a precipitous outcropping of the range, and their backs were hued in orange and pink as they crossed a last rise, and reached a broad flat glade at the foot of the cliff. There at last was Manholm. The bottom of the cliff face, for the last 250 or 300 feet, inclined sharply inward along a broad, half-oval front, leaving a cave like a deep, vertical bowl in the rock. Far back in the cave, where they were protected from the weather and yet still exposed to the open air, were the hooped tents of the Raman families. And in the front, under the shelter of the cliff, was the communal area, the open space and fires where the Raman cooked and talked and danced and sang together when they were not out on the plains with the Ranahin. The whole place seemed austere, as if generations of Raman had not worn a welcome for themselves in the stone. For Manholm was only a center, a beginning for the plains roaming of a nomadic people. Perhaps 70 Raman gathered to watch the company approach. They were nearly all Winholms, the young and old of the Raman, and others who needed safety and a secure bed. Unlike the cords and main thralls, they had no fighting ropes. But Lithe was there, and she walked lightly out to meet the company, with 3 other Raman whom Covenant took to be main thralls also. They wore necklets of yellow flowers like hers, and carried their cords in their hair rather than at their waists. The company halted, and Prothal dismounted before the main thralls. He bowed to them in the Raman fashion, and they gestured their welcome in return. "Hail again, lords from afar," said Lithe. "Hail, Ringthane and High Lord, and Giant and Bloodguard. Be welcome to the hearth and bed of Manholm." At her salutation, the Winholms surged forward from under the cliff. As the riders got down from their horses, each was greeted by a smiling Winholm, bearing a small band of woven flowers. With gestures of ritual stateliness, they fastened the bands to the right wrists of their guests. Covenant climbed off Dura and found a shy, bold Raman girl no more than 15 or 16 years old standing before him. She had fine black hair that draped her shoulders and soft, wide brown eyes. She did not smile. She seemed awed to find herself greeting the Ringthane, the wielder of the white gold. Carefully she reached out to put her flowers around his wrist. Their smell staggered him, and he nearly retched. The band was woven of amanibhavam. Its tang burned his nose like acid, made him so hungry that he felt about to vomit chunks of emptiness. He was helpless to stop the tears that ran from his eyes. With a face full of solemnity, the Winholm girl raised her hands and touched his tears as if they were precious. Behind him, the Ranahan of the Blood Guard were galloping off into the freedom of the plains. The cords were leading the company's horses away to be tended, and more Ramen cantered into the glade in answer to the news of the quest's arrival. But Covenant kept his eyes on the girl, stared at her as if she were a kind of food. Finally, she answered his gaze by saying, "I am Winholm Gay. Soon I will share enough knowing to join the cords." After an instant of hesitation, she added, "I am to care for you while you guest here." When he did not respond, she said hurriedly, "Others will gladly serve if my welcome is not accepted." Covenant remained silent for a moment longer, clenched his useless ferocity, but then he gathered his strength for one final refusal. "I don't need anything. Don't touch me." The words hurt in his throat. A hand touched his shoulder. He glanced around to find Foamfollower beside him. The giant was looking down at Covenant, but he spoke to the pain of rejection in Gay's face. "Do not be sad, little Winholm," he murmured. "Covenant Ringthane tests us. He does not speak his heart." Gay smiled gratefully up at Foamfollower, then said with sudden sauciness, "Not so little, giant. Your size deceives you. I have almost reached courting." Her jibe appeared to take a moment to penetrate Foamfollower. Then his stiff beard twitched. Abruptly he began to laugh. His glee mounted. It echoed off the cliff above Manholm until the mountain seemed to share his elation, and the infectious sound spread until everyone near him was laughing without knowing why. For a long moment he threw out gales as if he were blowing debris from his soul. But Covenant turned away, unable to bear the loud weight of the giant's humor. "Hellfire," he growled. "Hell and blood. What are you doing to me?" He had made no decision, and now his capacity for self-denial seemed spent. So when Gay offered to guide him to his seat for the feast which the Winholms had prepared, he followed her numbly. She took him under the ponderous overhang of the cliff to a central, clear space with a campfire burning in the middle. Most of the company had already entered Manholm. There were 2 other fires, and the Ramen divided the company into 3 groups. The Blood Guard sat around one of the fires, Quan and his 14 warriors around another, and in the center the Ramen invited Prothal, Morum, Foamfollower, Laura, Python, and Covenant to join the main thralls. Covenant let himself be steered until he was sitting cross-legged on the smooth stone floor, across the circle from Prothal, Morum, and Foamfollower. 4 main thralls made places for themselves beside the lords, and Lithe seated herself near Covenant. The rest of the circle was left with cords who had come in from the plains with their main thrall teachers. Most of the Winholms bustled around cooking fires farther back in the cave, but one stood behind each guest, waiting to serve. Gay attended Covenant, and she hummed a light melody, which reminded him of another song he had once heard. Something there is in beauty, which grows in the soul of the beholder like a flower. Under the wood smoke and the cooking odors, he thought he could smell Gay's clean, grassy fragrance. As he sat lumpishly on the stone, the last glow of the sunset waved orange and gold on the roof like an affectionate farewell. Then the sun was gone. Night spread over the plains. campfire flames gave the only light in Manholm. The air was full of bustle and low talk, like a hill breeze rich in Ranahin's scent. But the food Covenant dreaded did not come immediately. First, some of the chords danced. 3 of them performed within the circle where Covenant sat. They danced around the fire with high prancing movements and sang a nickering song to the beat of complex clapping from the Winholms. The smooth flow of their limbs, the sudden eruptions of the dance, the dark tan of their skins, made them look as if they were enacting the pulse of the plains, dancing the pulse by making it fast enough for human eyes to see. And they repeatedly bent their bodies so that the firelight cast horse-like shadows on the walls and ceiling. Occasionally the dancers leaped close enough to Covenant for him to hear their song. Grass-grown hooves and 4-head stars, hawks and withers, earthwood bloom, regal Ranahin, gallop, run. We serve the tail of the sky, mane of the world. The words in the dance made him feel that they expressed some secret knowledge, some vision that he needed to share. The feeling repelled him. He tore his eyes away from the dancers to the glowing coals of the fire. When the dance was done, he went on staring into the fire's heart with a gaze full of vague trepidations. Then the Winholms brought food and drink to the circles. Using broad leaves for plates, they piled stew and wild potatoes before their guests. The meal was savory with rare herbs, which the Ramin relished in their cooking, and soon the questers were deep in the feast. For a long time the only sounds in Manholm were those of serving and eating. In the midst of the feast, Covenant sat like a stunted tree. He did not respond to anything Gay offered him. He stared at the fire. There was one coal in it, which burned redly, like the night glow of his ring. He was doing a kind of VSE in his mind, studying his extremities from end to end, and his heart ached in the conviction that he was about to find some utterly unexpected spot of leprosy. He looked as if he were withering. After a time, people began to talk again. Prothal and Moram handed their leaf plates back to the Winholms and turned their attention to the main thralls. Covenant caught glimpses of their conversation. They were discussing him, the message he had brought to them, the role he played in the fate of the land. Their physical comfort contrasted strangely with the seriousness of their words. Near him, Foam Follower described the plight of Laura and Python to one of the main thralls. Covenant scowled into the fire. He did not need to look down to see the blood change which came over his ring. He could feel the radiation of wrong from the metal. He concealed the band under his fist and trembled. The stone ceiling seemed to hover over him like a cruel wing of revelation, awaiting the moment of his greatest helplessness to plunge onto his exposed neck. He was abysmally hungry. "I'm going crazy," he muttered into the flames. Winholm Gay urged him to eat, but he did not respond. Across the circle, Prothal was explaining the purpose of his quest. The main thralls listened uncertainly, as if they had trouble seeing the connection between evils far away and the plains of Ra. So the High Lord told them what had been done to Andalane. Python gazed with a blank unfocus out into the night, as if he were looking forward to moonrise. Beside him, Laura spoke quietly with the cords around her, grateful for the Ramin hospitality. As Foam Follower detailed the horrors which had been practiced on the 2 survivors of Soaring Woodhelven, his forehead nodded under the effort he made to contain his emotion. The fire shone like a door with an intolerable menace waiting behind it. The back of Covenant's neck was stiff with vulnerability, and his eyes stared blindly like knotholes. The green stains on his robe marked him like a warning that said, "Leper, outcast, unclean." He was nearing the end of his VSE. Behind him was the impossibility of believing the land true, and before him was the impossibility of believing it false. Abruptly, Gay entered the circle and confronted him, with her hands on her lips and her eyes flashing. She stood with her legs slightly apart so that he saw the bloody coals of the fire between her thighs. He glanced up at her. "You must take your food," she scolded. "Already you are half dead." Her shoulders were squared, drawing her shift tight over her breasts. She reminded him of Lena. Prothol was saying, "He has not told us all that occurred at the celebration. The ravage of the wraiths was not prevented, yet we believe he fought the Erviles in some way." His companion blamed both herself and him for the ill which befell the dance. Covenant trembled. Like Lena, he thought. Lena? Darkness pounced at him like claws of vertigo. Lena? For an instant, his vision was obscured by roaring and black waters. Then he crashed to his feet. He had done that to Lena. Done that? He flung the girl aside and jumped toward the fire. Lena! Swinging his staff like an axe, he chopped at the blaze, but he could not fight off the memory, could not throw it back. The staff twisted with the force of the blow, fell from his hands. Sparks and coals shattered, flew in all directions. He had done that to her. Shaking his half fist at Prothol, he cried, "She was wrong. I couldn't help it." Thinking, "Lena, what have I done?" "I'm a leper." Around him, people sprang to their feet. Moram came forward quickly, stretched out a restraining hand. "Softly, Covenant," he said. "What is wrong? We are guests." But even while he protested, Covenant knew that Aetiaran had not been wrong. He had seen himself kill at the Battle of Soaring Woodhelven, and had thought in his folly that being a killer was something new for him, something unprecedented. But it was not something he had recently become. He had been that way from the beginning of the dream, from the beginning. In an intuitive leap, he saw that there was no difference between what the Erviles had done to the wraiths and what he had done to Lena. He had been serving Lord Fowl since his first day in the land. "No," he spat as if he were boiling in acid. "No, I won't do it anymore. I'm not going to be the victim anymore. I will not be waited on by children." He shook with the ague of his rage as he cried to himself, "You raped her, you stinking bloody bastard." He felt as weak as if his understanding of what he had done corroded his bones. Moram said intently, "Unbeliever, what is wrong?" "No," Covenant repeated, "no." He was trying to shout, but his voice sounded distant, crippled. "I will not tolerate this. It isn't right. I am going to survive. Do you hear me?" "Who are you?" Mainthral Lithe hissed through taut lips. With a quick shake of her head, a flick of her wrist, she pulled the cord from her hair and held it battle-ready. Prothol caught her arm. His old voice rattled with authority and supplication. "Forgive, Mainthral. This matter is beyond you. He holds the wild magic that destroys peace. We must forgive." "Forgive?" Covenant tried to shout. His legs failed under him, but he did not fall. Banor held him erect from behind. "You can't forgive." "Do you ask to be punished?" Moram said incredulously. "What have you done?" "Ask?" Covenant struggled to recollect something. Then he found it. He knew what he had to do. "No, call the Ranahin." "What?" snapped Lithe in indignation, and all the Ramina echoed her protest. The Ranahin, call them. Are you mad? Have a care, Ringthane. We are the Ramen. We do not call, we serve. They come as they will. They are not for your calling, and they do not come at night. Call, I tell you. I call them. Something in his terrible urgency confounded her. She hesitated, stared at him in confused anger and protest and unexpected compassion, then turned on her heel and strode out of Manholm. Supported by Banar, Covenant tottered out from under the oppressive weight of the mountain. The company and the Ramen trailed after him like a wake of dumbfounded outrage. Behind them, the red moon had just crested the mountain, and the distant plains visible beyond the foothills in front of Manholm were already awash with crimson. The incarnadine flood seemed to untexture the earth, translate rock and soil and grass into decay and bitter blood. The people spread out on either side of the flat so that the open ground was lit by the campfires. Into the night walked Lithe, moving toward the plains until she stooped near the far edge of the glade. Covenant stopped and watched her. Unsteadily but resolutely, he freed himself from Branor's support, stood on his own like a wrecked galleon left by the tide, perched impossibly high on a reef. Moving woodenly, he went toward Lithe. Before him, the bloody vista of the moonlight lay like a dead sea, and it tugged at him as it flowed closer with each degree of the moonrise. His ring smoldered coldly. He felt that he was the lodestone. Sky and earth were alike hued scarlet, and he walked outward as if he were the pole on which the red night turned. He and his ring, the force which compelled that tide of violated night. Soon he stood in the center of the open flat. A winding sheet of silence enwrapped the onlookers. Ahead of him, Main-Thrall Lithe spread her arms as if she were beckoning the darkness toward her. Abruptly, she gave a shrill cry. Kellen Brabanal Marushin, Rushin Hainin Kellenkur, Rilin Narunal, Ranahin Kellen Brabanal. Then she whistled once. It echoed off the cliff like a shriek. For a long moment, silence choked the flat. Striding defiantly, Lithe moved back toward Manholm. As she passed Covenant, she snapped, "I have called." Then she was behind him, and he faced the siege of the moonlight alone. But shortly there came a rumbling of hooves. Great horses pounded the distance. The sound swelled as if the hills themselves were rolling Manholmward. Scores of Ranahin approached. Covenant locked his knees to keep himself upright. His heart felt too weak to go on beating. He was dimly conscious of the hushed suspense of the spectators. Then the outer edge of the flat seemed to rise up redly, and a wave of Ranahin broke into the open. Nearly 100 chargers galloping abreast like a wall at Covenant. A cry of amazement and admiration came from the Ramen. Few of the oldest main thralls had ever seen so many Ranahin at one time. And Covenant knew that he was looking at the proudest flesh of the land. He feared that they were going to trample him. But the pounding wall broke away to his left, ran around him until he was completely encircled. Manes and tails tossing, forehead stars catching the firelight as they flashed past, 50 Ranahin thundered on the turf and enclosed him. The sound of their hooves roared in his ears. Their circle grew tighter as they ran. Their reeling strength snatched at his fear, pulled him around with them, as if he were trying to face them all at once. His heart labored painfully. He could not turn fast enough to keep up with them. The effort made him stumble, lose his balance, fall to his knees. But the next instant he was erect again, with his legs planted against the vertical of their circling, and his face contorted as if he were screaming, a cry lost in the thunder of Ranahan hooves. His arms spread as if they were braced against opposing walls of night. Slowly, tortuously, the circle came stamping and fretting to a halt. The Ranahan faced inward toward Covenant. Their eyes rolled, and several of them had froth on their lips. At first he failed to comprehend their emotion. From the onlookers came a sudden cry. He recognized Laura's voice. Turning, he saw Python running toward the horses, with Laura struggling after him, too far behind to catch him. The child had caught everyone by surprise. They had been watching Covenant. Now Python reached the circle and scrambled among the frenzied feet of the Ranahan. It seemed impossible that he would not be trampled. His head was no larger than one of their hooves, and the chargers were stamping, skittering. Then Covenant saw his chance. With an instinctive leap, he snatched Python from under one of the horses. His half-unfingered hand could not retain its grip. Python sprawled away from him. Immediately the child jumped to his feet. He dashed at Covenant and struck as hard as he could. "They hate you," he raged. "Go away." Moonlight fell into the flat as if it had sprung from the sides of the mountain. In the crimson glow, Python's little face looked like a wasteland. The child struggled, but Covenant lifted him off the ground, gripped him to his chest with both arms. Restraining Python in his hug, he looked up at the Ranahan. Now he understood. In the past, he had been too busy avoiding them to notice how they reacted to him. They were not threatening him. These great chargers were terrified of him. Their eyes shied off his face, and they scattered foam flecks about them. The muscles of their legs and chests quivered, yet they came agonized forward. Their old role was reversed. Instead of choosing their riders, they were submitting themselves to his choice. On an impulse, he unwrapped his left arm from Python and flourished his cold ring at one of the horses. It flinched and ducked, as if he had thrust a serpent at it, but it held its ground. He gripped Python again. The child's struggles were weaker now, as if Covenant's hug slowly smothered him. But the Unbeliever clung. He stared wildly at the Ranahan and wavered as if he could not regain his balance. But he had already made his decision. He had seen the Ranahan recognize his ring. Clenching Python to his heart like a helm, he cried, "Listen," in a voice as hoarse as a sob. "Listen, I'll make a bargain with you. Get it right. Hellfire, get it right. A bargain. Listen, I can't stand. I'm falling apart. Apart." He clenched Python. I see what's happening to you. You're afraid. You're afraid of me. You think I'm some kind of... All right, you're free. I don't choose any of you. The Ranahan watched him fearfully. But you've got to do things for me. You've got to back off. That wail almost took the last of his strength. You, the land. He panted, pleaded. Let me be. Don't ask so much. But he knew that he needed something more from them in return for his forbearance, something more than their willingness to suffer his unbelief. Listen, listen. If I need you, you had better come, so that I don't have to be a hero. Get it right. His eyes bled tears, but he was not weeping. And there's one more thing. One more. Lena, a girl. She lives in Mythel Stonedown, daughter of Trell and Atiaran. I want one of you to go to her tonight, and every year, at the last full moon before the middle of spring. Ranahan are what she dreams about. He shook the tears out of his eyes and saw the Ranahan regarding him as if they understood everything. And they had understood everything he had tried to say. "Now go," he gasped. "Have mercy on me." With a sudden, bursting, united neigh, all the Ranahan reared around him, pawing the air over his head as if they were delivering promises. Then they wheeled, whinnying with relief, and charged away from Manholm. The moonlight did not appear to touch them. They dropped over the edge of the flat and vanished as if they were being welcomed into the arms of the earth. Almost at once, Laura reached Covenant's side. Slowly, he released Python to her. She gave him a long look that he could not read, then turned away. He followed her, trudging as if he were overburdened with the pieces of himself. He could hear the amazement of the Ramen, amazement too strong for them to feel any offense at what he had done. He was beyond them. He could hear it. They reared to him, the whispers ran, but he did not care. He was perversely sick with the sense that he had mastered nothing, proved nothing, resolved nothing. Lord Moram came out to join him. Covenant did not meet Moram's gaze, but he heard complex wonder in the Lord's voice as he said, Lord, ah, such honor has never been done to mortal man or woman. Many have come to the plains and have been offered to the Ranahan and refused, and when Lord Tamarantha, my mother, was offered, 5 Ranahan came to consider her. 5. It was a higher honor than she had dreamed possible. We could not hear. Have you refused them? Refused? Refused, Covenant groaned. They hate me. He pushed past Moram and shambled into Manholm. Moving unsteadily like a ship with a broken keel, he headed toward the nearest cooking fire. The Ramen made way for him, watched him pass with awe in their faces. He did not care. He reached the fire and grabbed the first food he saw. The meat slipped in his half hand, so he held it with his left fist and devoured it. He ate blankly, swallowing food in chunks and taking more by the fistful. Then he wanted something to drink. He looked around, discovered Foam Follower standing nearby with a flagon of diamond draught, dwarfed in his huge hand. Covenant took the flagon and drained it. Then he stood numbly still, waiting for the diamond draught's effect. It came swiftly. Soon mist began to fill his head. His hearing seemed hollow, as if he were listening to Manholm from the bottom of a well. He knew that he was going to pass out, wanted hungrily to pass out, but before he lost consciousness, the hurt in his chest made him say, Giant, I need friends. Why do you believe that you have none? Covenant blinked and saw everything that he had done in the land. Don't be ridiculous. Then you do believe that we are real. What? Covenant groped for the giant's meaning with hands which had no fingers. You think us capable of not forgiving you, Foam Follower explained. Who would forgive you more readily than your dream? No, Foam Follower, no, the Unbeliever said. Dreams never forgive. Then he lost the firelight and Foam Follower's kind face and stumbled into sleep.